The first time I heard about the Valencia, I was sipping coffee at a diner in Port Angeles, Washington, in early August 2024. A weathered fisherman 3 stools down glanced at the Strait of Juan de Fuca and said, almost to himself, "You know about the ghost ship that haunts these waters?" I smiled politely and shrugged. He answered by telling me about the SS Valencia, a coastal passenger steamer built in Philadelphia in 1882, 252 feet long, that served on the East Coast before being transferred to the Pacific. In January 1906, bound from San Francisco to Seattle with more than 170 souls aboard, she passed the entrance to the Strait of Juan de Fuca in foul weather and slammed into a reef just offshore from Vancouver Island. Caught between pounding breakers and a 100-foot rock cliff, the ship was trapped. Over the next 36 hours, terrified passengers clung to the rigging as waves smashed Valencia to pieces. Only 37 people survived, 136 perished, including all of the women and children. The Valencia disaster gave Vancouver Island's southwest coast its macabre nickname, the Graveyard of the Pacific, where almost 70 ships have wrecked. I was fascinated. Later, back home in Seattle, I did more digging. The Valencia wasn't just a tragic wreck. It was the centerpiece of one of the Pacific Northwest's eeriest legends. In June 1910, the Seattle Times reported that mariners claimed to see a phantom ship resembling the Valencia near Pachena Point. Rumors spread that indigenous fishermen had spotted a lifeboat rowed by skeletons. In 1933, the ship's lifeboat number 5 was found floating in Barkley Sound, still in remarkably good condition despite 27 years adrift. As decades passed, sailors continued to whisper about seeing the ghostly outline of a steamer on stormy nights, waves breaking over her deck, while gaunt figures clung to the rigging. The idea of a phantom vessel haunted me. By mid-September, I decided to take a solo camping trip to Pachena Bay, just south of the wreck site, to hike part of the West Coast Trail, the life-saving trail created after the Valencia disaster. The trail traverses dense rainforest and skirts sheer cliffs. Parks Canada now maintains it for hikers, but the wilderness still feels untouched. It was a 6-hour drive from Seattle to the ferry at Port Angeles, then another several hours along gravel roads to Bamfield. The last miles were slow and eerie. Huge cedars leaned over the single-lane road. Mist drifted between the trunks. When I finally reached Pachena Bay, dusk was falling. The air smelled of salt and hemlock. I set up my tent near the trailhead, and as the sun slipped behind the Pacific, I could hear the low boom of waves against distant rocks, the same rocks that ripped the Valencia's hull apart over a century earlier. Around midnight, as I lay awake listening to the surf, I caught a different sound. It was faint at first, like the creak of oarlocks. I sat up, my heart beating fast. The night was pitch black except for a thin slice of moon. The sound grew louder and more rhythmic, accompanied by the faint thud of wooden oars dipping into water. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight and walked down to the beach. The sand was damp under my boots. A cold wind blew, carrying with it a smell of salt and something musty, almost like old canvas. The bay opened up before me, a dark expanse dotted with pale foam where waves broke. For a moment I saw nothing unusual. Then a white shape emerged from the gloom about 50 yards offshore. I strained my eyes. It was a lifeboat, its hull bleached and weather-worn, moving steadily through the waves without any engine. I raised my light, and as the beam swept across the boat, I felt the blood drain from my face. 8 skeletal figures sat along the gunwales, fleshless hands wrapped around oars. Their empty eye sockets stared straight ahead. Their jaws hung open as if caught mid-scream. Tattered clothing fluttered on their bones. The boat glided past me silently, the oars moving in perfect unison, even though there were no muscles to drive them. I stumbled back up the beach, trembling. What happened next is burned into my memory. As the lifeboat disappeared into the fog, the roar of surf intensified until it sounded like a train. Then, out beyond the breakers, a dark silhouette rose from the water. At first it looked like a bank of smoke, but as it grew, the shape resolved into the outline of a steamer. 2 masts, a single smokestack, and a long, low hull. Waves crashed over her bow, white water pouring down her decks. Through my binoculars, I could make out human figures clinging to the rigging, their faces pale and contorted. The ship seemed to be steaming straight toward the rocks at the edge of the bay. I heard a weak, wavering whistle blast, the sound of a ship signaling distress. My rational mind screamed that this was impossible. The Valencia had sunk in 1906. Yet there she was, ghostly and gray, approaching the same deadly reef. I didn't move. The phantom steamer kept coming, closer and closer, until I could read the name on her bow. Valencia. She was maybe 200 feet from the cliffs when she began to fade. It was as if a curtain of fog swept over her. First the bow vanished, then the masts, then the figures clinging to her rigging. The final thing I saw was a woman's arm reaching upward before dissolving into mist. The roar of the surf returned to normal. The beach was once again empty. I stood on the sand for a long time, heart hammering, until I felt foolish and scared in equal measure. Had I fallen asleep and dreamed it? Maybe my mind, primed by local legends, had conjured the whole thing. But the next morning, when I returned to the shoreline, I found fresh tracks in the wet sand, narrow gouges as if made by a heavy boat being dragged across the beach. I followed them to a cluster of driftwood and stopped cold. There, half buried in seaweed, lay a rusted brass nameplate the length of my forearm. The letters were worn but legible. Valencia. I have always been fascinated and unnerved by the cases that made Ed and Lorraine Warren household names. Growing up in suburban New York, every Halloween someone would whisper the story of the Dutch colonial at 112 Ocean Avenue in Amityville, Long Island. They would speak in hushed tones about a house with quarter-moon windows staring like eyes over the river, about cold spots and voices that told priests to get out. But it wasn't until I started digging into the history as a young journalist that I realized how deeply this legend is rooted in grim fact. The tragedy began on a quiet Wednesday night, November 13th, 1974. Police were called to the DeFeo family home at 112 Ocean Avenue and found a horrifying scene. 23-year-old Ronald Butch DeFeo Jr. had shot and killed his parents and his 4 siblings in their beds. The house, built around 1924, stood on the edge of South Oyster Bay. DeFeo was arrested, and after a 7-week trial, he was convicted of second-degree murder in November 1975 and sentenced to 6 terms of 25 years to life. Locals still remember the horror. Some whisper that the tragedy left a stain on the property. 13 months later, hoping for a fresh start, George and Kathy Lutz bought the house for what was considered a bargain price, $80,000. With Kathy's 3 children and their dog, they moved in on December 18, 1975. Most of the DeFeo family's furniture was still inside. A friend suggested they have the house blessed, so they invited a Catholic priest, Father Ralph Pecoraro, called Father Mancuso in Jay Anson's book, to perform the rite. As he sprinkled holy water and prayed in an upstairs bedroom, he reportedly heard a deep male voice growl, "Get out!" He didn't mention the voice until later, but soon after he developed a high fever and blisters on his hands resembling stigmata. It was an ominous start. The Lutzes only lasted 28 days in the house. George said he woke up around 3:15 a.m. each night, about the time the DeFeo murders were thought to have occurred. Swarms of flies appeared in winter. Kathy dreamed about the murders and found herself knowing which rooms each victim had died in. Their children slept on their stomachs, like the DeFeo victims were discovered. The house smelled alternately of perfume and excrement. A hidden red room in the basement spooked the dog. Their daughter Missy said she had an imaginary friend named Jody, a demonic pig with glowing red eyes. Doors and windows were damaged by unseen forces. Green slime oozed from keyholes and walls. These events, George later admitted, were only part of what drove them away. The rest was too frightening to recount. On January 14, 1976, the Lutzes fled, leaving their belongings behind. By then, word of the haunting had reached local media. On March 6, 1970, a month and a half after the Lutzes left, Ed and Lorraine Warren, self-described demonologists who had investigated cases like the Perrin family's farmhouse in Rhode Island, were invited to 112 Ocean Avenue. They arrived with a Channel 5 New York news crew and reporter Michael Linder. Tech specialist Gene Campbell set up infrared time-lapse cameras around the house. The Warrens claimed to feel an oppressive, inhuman presence. During the night, Campbell's camera captured an image that still unsettles me. A small figure peering out of a doorway, eyes glowing white in the darkness. When the photo surfaced in 1979, the Warrens and the Lutzes presented it on the Merv Griffin show as evidence. Skeptics called it a trick of light, but Lorraine Warren insisted it was a demonic boy. The Warrens and parapsychologist Hans Holzer declared the house infested with malevolent spirits. I wasn't born when the Warrens visited, but decades later I found myself standing outside the very same house. The quarter-round eye windows have been removed and the address changed to discourage sightseers. The Dutch Colonial, now painted a pale gray, looks like any well-kept suburban home. Cars pass on Ocean Avenue, and a for sale sign from 2010 still lies in my memory when the house sold for nearly $1 million. Neighbors are tired of the story. The Amityville Historical Society refuses to discuss it. I stood across the street on a cloudy afternoon, expecting nothing. Yet, I couldn't shake the heaviness in my chest. I was allowed inside briefly by a real estate agent. The entryway was bright with sunlight from the bay window. There were no flies, no slime, no pig demons. But as we climbed the staircase to the second floor, I felt a sudden drop in temperature, as if I'd stepped into a walk-in freezer. The agent laughed it off, saying old houses have drafts. In the small bedroom that had once belonged to Mark and John DeFeo, my head throbbed. I thought about Father Pecoraro flicking holy water and hearing that disembodied command. I imagined the Warrens here in 1976, Lorraine clutching her rosary, Ed demanding the spirit reveal itself. Did they really encounter something supernatural? Or did the weight of the house's history conjure fear out of ordinary creaks and shadows? On my way out, I paused at the basement door. The red room that George Lutz discovered is now a storage nook. Its walls have been painted white. The dog, long gone, couldn't warn me. I pressed my hand to the doorway and felt nothing but cool wood. The rational part of me knows that subsequent owners, including the Cromartie family who bought the house for $55,000 in March 1977, lived there peacefully and reported no disturbances. Yet, the legend endures. Perhaps it persists because the facts are so stark. A mass murder, a family fleeing in terror, a photograph of a boy with glowing eyes that has never been adequately explained. Or maybe we need places like Amityville. We parked along a dirt road and hiked through the dark to the trestle. Crickets hummed and cicadas droned, a wall of sound that made it hard to hear our own footsteps. The bridge loomed above the creek, a skeletal line of iron that seemed to float over the ravine. We climbed up the embankment and stepped onto the tracks, careful to stay close together. It was 2:45 a.m. If the legend were true, we had minutes before the hour of the wreck. I could feel my heart thumping in my throat, half with excitement, half with fear. As we waited, we told ourselves the story again. In the early hours of August 27, 1891, train number 99 left Statesville 34 minutes late and tried to make up time by pushing to 35-40 miles per hour. 5 minutes after leaving the station, it derailed, crashing off Bastian's Bridge. The sleeper car flew 153 feet and landed on its side. Survivors described a scene of mangled wood and metal, screams and groans, bodies thrown into the creek, and the sickening smell of steam and blood. Baggage master Hugh K. Linster was found with a broken neck. Some say his spirit lingers, pacing the tracks with his golden pocket watch. The minutes dragged. The only light came from the milky glow of distant street lamps and the faint stars peering through humidity. Someone whispered that maybe the story was just that. A story. Then a faint, far-off whistle cut through the night. My skin prickled. It sounded old, not like the deep blast of diesel horns we hear today, but like a high-pitched wail from a bygone era. It came again, closer. Beneath our feet, the rails thrummed. We fumbled for our phones and cameras, but there was nothing to see. The whistling grew louder, merging with a cacophony of metallic clanging and what sounded like human voices screaming and moaning. A chill wind blew across the bridge, smelling faintly of smoke and oil. Out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw a figure walking toward us along the tracks. A man in a dark uniform, his head bowed, his hand clutched around something that glinted in the faint light. I blinked and he was gone. But the sounds continued louder and louder, as if an invisible locomotive were crashing through our group. Panic clawed at my chest. I remembered the 2010 incident and Christopher Kaiser's fate. A group of about a dozen ghost hunters waited on the bridge when a real train suddenly rounded a bend. They didn't hear it until the last minute, authorities said. When they realized the eastbound train was coming, they ran about 150 feet toward Statesville. But only Kaiser was struck and thrown to the bottom of the 100-foot ravine. He died, saving another woman's life. I didn't want to add my name to a similar headline. My friends and I clutched each other's shirts and inched toward the embankment, eyes scanning the darkness for headlights. Suddenly, the rails in front of us lit up with a pale bluish light. It wasn't the sharp white of a modern locomotive. It flickered like a lantern behind frosted glass. For a moment, the outline of a train materialized, a steam engine billowing ghostly smoke, wooden cars with oil lamps hanging in the windows, and faces pressed to the panes. A mournful wail cut through the air. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it dissolved into mist. The noises stopped. The night resumed its hum. We stood frozen, mouths open, not daring to breathe. A minute later, the very real roar of a diesel engine pierced the silence. A Norfolk Southern Freightliner, a modern engine with 2 locomotives and no freight cars like the one in the 2010 accident, rounded the bend. We hadn't heard it until that moment. Adrenaline shot through me as we scrambled off the trestle, tripping over ties and sliding down the embankment just as the train thundered past. We spent the rest of the night sitting by the creek, shaking and whispering about what we'd experienced. Was the phantom train we saw a trick of the imagination, triggered by the story we'd been telling ourselves? Or did we actually witness the residual energy of the 1891 disaster, a replaying of the fatal plunge that killed 22 people? Was the timing, a ghostly vision followed by a real train, pure coincidence or some kind of warning? I don't have answers. All I know is that the screams we heard did not sound like anything I've ever heard from a television speaker. They were raw, human, and filled with terror. The legend of the Bastille Bridge ghost train has endured for more than a century because there is something about railroads that feels timeless and unstoppable. Tracks are lines drawn across the landscape, connecting past and present, prosperity and tragedy. Standing on that bridge, I felt like I was straddling a moment in history I could never fully understand. I'm grateful we left when we did. I think of Christopher Kaiser and the others who have died, chasing a glimpse of a ghost, and of the passengers of 1891 whose last moments have become a spectacle for thrill seekers. The next time August 27 rolls around, I'll remember the thrill and the fear, but I'll watch from a safe distance. Some anniversaries are better honored from afar.